Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Spain online event in conversation with Sarvat Hasin. I'm Sarah Shaffi, and I'm delighted to be talking today to Sarvat about her novel, The Giant Dark. Sarvat grew up in Pakistan and now lives in London and works at the Almeida Theatre. She studied politics and international relations at Royal Holloway and has a master's in creative writing from the University of Oxford. Her first novel, This Wide Night, was published by Penguin India and longlisted for the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. Her second book, You Can't Go Home Again, was published in 2018 and featured in Vogue India's and The Hindu's end of year list. She won the Moth Writers Retreat Bursary in 2018 and the Mose Charan Prize in 2019. Her essays and poetries have appeared in publications including Outsiders, the Maze Anthology, English Pen, and Harper's Bazaar. And The Giant Dark is her latest novel, and it is absolutely brilliant. Welcome, Sarvat.
Hello.
Let's start by getting you to introduce The Giant Dark to everybody. So can you tell us in 2 sentences what it is about, please?
So it is a sort of contemporary retelling of the Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. And it's also a love story and a story about fans and fandom and consumption of art.
Brilliant. For anyone unfamiliar with it, give us a quick outline of that Orpheus and Eurydice myth.
So the Orpheus and Eurydice myth is sort of like a part of the bigger Orpheus myth. And his story sort of rolls on before and after her. So she's almost like a chapter in his life, but like a really defining one. Eurydice is Orpheus's wife. Orpheus is kind of like the original rock star. He's this incredible poet. He's got a beautiful voice. He's a little bit like a celebrity in that world. And he meets and falls in love with Eurydice, which happens quite quickly in the myth, as it often does in mythology. And on the day of their wedding, this is, I think the most common version, she is bitten by a snake and she dies, and he's so distraught without her, he can't live without her, so he goes into the underworld to bring her back, and charms everyone in the underworld, including Hades with his beautiful voice, and makes this bargain where he's allowed to bring his wife back, and she will follow him back to Earth. The only thing he has to do is not turn around and look at her. And as they're walking back, he keeps hearing her voice being echoed around him. And she's calling his name, and he turns around and he looks back and he loses her forever.
Do you recall sort of how old you were when you first heard this story, and what is it about it that fascinates you so, or kind of that you love so much about it?
So I had a lot of those, there's big compendiums of Greek myths that people have on their children. I had sort of every stage of those. So I had the picture book, and then I had the ones in which they're little potted histories, and then the more detailed ones. So I was sort of reading Greek mythology for a really long time when I was a child and when I was a teenager. I'm not a classicist, I didn't study it, but I was really, really fascinated with it as a child, and with other kinds of mythology as well, Egyptian mythology. And so a lot of those stories, those forms of stories really stuck with me. I think the thing about the Orpheus one is it's so quick, and it's this idea of instant regret. You can do one thing and the course of your life has changed. But also, when I sort of started thinking about it again in the early stages of coming up with the idea for this book, I realized that it sort of it recurs so much through history, and not just through cultural history, but contemporary art history and film and books. I read a lot of retellings of the Orpheus and Eurydice myth, and I watched Hadestown, and I listened to the album, and I read lots of novels and things like that, and I watched Cocteau's Orphe. But then there were all of the films that don't necessarily announce themselves as Orpheus retellings that were sort of sticking in my head. And once I sort of started seeing it, I could see it everywhere. And almost every film about, a man whose wife dies and his journey begins, and that's the beginning of his quest, felt to me like an Orpheus and Eurydice film. Almost everything about grief and the idea of trying to bring someone back had echoes of that for me.
Greek myths and Greek tragedies really often involve like an element of power or magic. So you described there, Orpheus goes to the underworld and he charms everyone, and they say, "Well, yeah, sure, you can have
Your wife
Eurydice
back."
and they're often, even if they're not so explicitly kind of about otherworldly things, they are often quite exaggerated in their circumstances. How did you approach this retelling and decide sort of what elements you were going to keep and that would work in a contemporary retelling, and what elements you perhaps needed to do something different with, or even you needed to discard really for this book to work?
So I've played quite fast and loose with the myth, and I think less than discarding elements, a lot of the elements have changed shape. So the underworld isn't quite what you think it will be. And the turning back isn't quite what you think it will be. So a lot of the classic sort of point to the myth, I think I've reshaped to suit a contemporary setting. But beyond that, I think the biggest thing that I went into the story wanting to do was that in a lot of retellings of the Orpheus and Eurydice myth, you start from the point where she dies. And like, that's the story. The story is beautiful marriage, two people very much in love, she's dead. And I found that quite difficult to try and think of a contemporary retelling that was written that way, because you are meant to believe in their love story. And I think that's the problem with myths often, is that they're beautiful stories, but they're sort of quite flat psychologically. And I sort of wanted to have that extra layer to it, that third dimension. And I thought, if you're going to believe in this love story that is so great, and these two people who love each other so much that their love can overturn the forces of nature, then you kind of have to see them fall in love first. So that was probably the biggest shift, is I knew I wanted the first half to be them falling in love and them getting together before anything else happened. And I really wanted it, despite the fact that she's the Orpheus character in this novel is a woman, Ida. And despite the fact that Ida is like a famous rock star, I wanted the relationship between her and Ehsan, her lover, to be really intimate and to feel quite close. Not just them being close, but us being close to them. And I wanted it to feel like we were sort of cocooned in this world of falling in love with them, which is, quite hard to do, but then keep that sort of epicness and that magic. And which is where the chorus sort of steps in, because so the book is told through the perspective of Ida, who is the Orpheus character, and Ehsan, who is the Eurydice character. And the third voice in the book is a chorus of her fans. And they sort of exist for that Greek tragedy element as much as anything else, because there is that thing in Greek tragedy where you have this sense of inevitability and epicness, and the idea that you are watching a story unfold that's unfolded before, and that is, living history. So that's where I sort of tried to put the more magical aspects of it.
Because that chorus is, so like you say, it's something that appears often in Greek myths and especially in Greek tragedies, and there is that sort of inevitability to it. If a chorus is around and they're commenting on something, that something's probably gonna go wrong, and they're not there to like celebrate all the good stuff in life. And there's that added element, because you have made them a group of fans. They are Ida's fans, and they are in some ways quite obsessive fans, and obsessiveness, I think, sort of runs through the novel in the relationship that the fans have with Ida, this rock star, this musician. But also I think there's an element of obsessiveness in the relationship between Ida and Ehsan as well. I want to ask you a little bit more about that chorus, because you were doing that sort of a sort of retelling. Were you always going to have the chorus in it, or were there ever drafts that you wrote where they didn't appear and it didn't quite work and then you added them in?
So the chorus, almost everything has changed about this novel since when I first started writing it. So it was originally set somewhere different, and it was a more traditional retelling in the sense that the Orpheus character was a man and the Eurydice character was the woman, and the underworld was an actual place that they went to. And none of that is there now. But the only thing that's remained constant is the chorus. And it's sort of one of those things where I always think writing is part work and part sort of something just clicks. And there's almost, really annoyingly, there's almost no difference in quality between those things. Like you can work at something for a really long time and get it good, and it needs you to do 10 drafts before it's even readable. And then some ideas will sort of come to you and they will exist and they'll be sort of ready. So within the three perspectives, that's sort of what it was like. The chorus sort of arrived in my brain and it was ready. And I could have written that chorus at any point and it probably wouldn't have been very difficult. Whereas the perspectives as the two lovers took quite a long time and took quite lots of honing and lots of rewrites and lots of like real study to get their voices right. But no, I found, partly because I've been an obsessive fan of things, and everyone I know has, and I'm friends with people who really love music, and we talk about music a lot, and we talk about when there's a band, there's a band that a lot of my friends really like, and when we talk about them, we talk about how much we like their songs, but we also talk about different song lyrics and how they have a song lyric that recurs in their albums, and it feels like a secret for us, it feels like a secret for the fans, and what that means. And so I'm sort of used to minor versions of the, not just the obsession, but the study that Ida's fans do, where everything she does is meaningful to them.
Because they do, it is in that aspect, I guess it is a sort of a mystery novel as well, at least from the chorus's point of view, because everything that Ada does is so infused with meaning for the fans, whether or not she intends it that way. And part of what the book deals with is kind of this group of fans and us as readers then, because we're almost, I guess we're supposed to be part of that fan group in some ways, trying to uncover the true story, or what we think is the true story of that moment in her life. So tell us a little bit about that kind of element of uncovering what really happens in the book and what really happens to the characters.
Yeah, I sort of wanted it to have an almost Russian doll type structure. So we open with the chorus of fans, and then we go to Ida's perspective, and then we go to Ehsan's perspective. And I think the music sort of runs through those three voices, because the fans are obsessed with Ida, who makes the music that they love. Ida makes the music that they love because she's in love with Ehsan and she's making the music about him and to some degree for him. So he's sort of the secret at the center of the book. And I think we all sort of have that a little bit when we're thinking about not just musicians, but also writers, that sort of like secret gossipy element of like, when you're reading someone's book and they're a little bit in the public eye and you're like, I wonder if this is about that, or I wonder who, if you read a really, really good love poem, you're like, I wonder how the person who this is written about feels. And I wonder what they think about being the subject of this poem being read by so many people, and other people reading that poem at their weddings. And this image that someone else has made of them being reproduced this many times. So I sort of wanted it to be like you're going from the outside in, and he's the sort of secret that you're trying to get at. Because and obviously it's not that simple, but to some degree he's the secret to understanding her music, because she's a very private person and they don't really know anything about her love life. So they're in this sense of discovery, almost like a jealous boyfriend or something. And again, like I was saying, sort of having been a big fan of certain musicians and things like that before, made it easy to sort of plot how that could happen if you blew that up to just a scale of obsessive fandom that is not just obsessive, but also like a group thing. And I think that is part of loving anything, is that it's fun to love things as a group.
It is interesting because as you're talking about fandom, I think we still see that play out. If anything, we see it play out more publicly nowadays. Like I think of things like Britney Spears, and obviously all the very recent fascination with her, and that kind of looking at everything she's saying and sort of investigating it as well. I'd love to go back to something you said earlier about how initially you'd done kind of quite a straight retelling of this, and your Orpheus character was a male and your Eurydice was a female, and obviously now it's gender flipped. Tell us about why initially you had gone for something perhaps a little bit more, I don't know if conventional is the right word to use, and at what moment you realized that flipping it actually made sort of elevated the story for you.
So I think it was just sheer laziness, to be honest. And also because when you think about sort of like a tragic musical figure, I don't think people think about even someone like Amy Winehouse in the same way that they do Kurt Cobain or Jeff Buckley. There is a certain gravitas that we as a culture attach to male musicians that we don't really to our female musicians. And actually, when the flip happened, that distance became interesting to me. And I was like, oh, that will make this chorus voice more interesting, because they were a much more benevolent chorus when I first wrote them. They were only worshipful and adoring. And yes, still jealous and obsessive, but not in a way that felt as insidious. And actually, you mentioned Britney, and I was thinking about Britney a lot when I was writing this, because when I was a really young child, like Britney was the defining sort of like pop star for my generation. And I sort of like just was a little bit too young. I slightly missed Spice Girls. Like I was aware of them, but I wasn't really aware enough even of music to love them that much. Whereas Britney and Christina were like it. When I was beginning to try to develop my own tastes as a child, and growing up with her and seeing people turn on her and seeing that switch was so interesting. And when I began to think of it in that way, it made so much more sense that she would be a woman, because within the Orpheus story, there are points where people turn on him. Like there's one of the famous conclusions of his story after he comes back to Earth is that the Maenads rip him from limb to limb, and his like disembodied head just sits somewhere and continues to sing, which I sort of loved. I loved the idea of that. It's very gruesome, but I did like the idea of really writing a figure that is so publicly adored, and then public attention sort of changes on them. And we see that happen so often with women. And, you know, we talk about this quite a lot anyway, but, you know, there's so many figures where it's like, oh, we all hate her now. Why? Because she cried at the Oscars. And yeah, I think it's really fascinating to me psychologically.
I guess it adds a layer, because even though in the book Ida's fans love her, and even though in reality you see that, and fans would describe themselves as always kind of loving whatever pop star or actor or writer they are part of the fandom for, when it is a woman, there is that sometimes conscious but also sometimes unconscious kind of layer of misogyny. There is a layer of sometimes racism as well, depending on ethnicity, and I guess we're all affected by the fact that we live in a patriarchal structure. So were you sort of thinking about how that would perhaps also, and perhaps you were thinking about it unconsciously as well, how that would manifest when it came to to Ida as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think she's very, very aware of her image throughout the book, as anyone who's in the public eye must be. But I think particularly when you're a woman and you're a woman of colour, I think it must be really, really difficult to not be constantly paranoid. And I was thinking about sort of the nature of her fans. So someone described the chorus as a female chorus a few weeks ago, which I thought was interesting because I don't think it's a wrong reading because the chorus doesn't have a gender. But for me, it isn't a solely female chorus. And that's one of the things I thought would be really interesting to explore when I made the shift. And it was one of the things that I found difficult about making the shift. I was sort of thinking, oh, I want to write this sort of we collective genderless voice. And it's very easy to imagine people of multiple genders loving a male singer, because you have lots of examples of that. And it was more difficult to imagine people of multiple genders loving a female singer. And I was like, why is that? Why am I finding difficulty with that? And actually, I sort of started thinking about the gender flip, luckily for me, before the pandemic hit. So I went to quite a lot of gigs that year, and I went to quite a lot of gigs on my own, which is not something I do very often. And I remember going to see Mitski, and who is sort of, you know, like definitely an Ida inspiration, very much sad girl, rock music. And I remember seeing all of these like quite big, muscly, bearded, tattooed all over men. It was only a really small venue. It was like in Rough Trade in Brick Lane. And these dudes just like weeping. I was like, that is, why do we pretend that, you know, in a very sort of like childish way of like, this music is for boys and this music is for girls? I kind of wanted to create a rock star who had that sort of universal appeal and write that chorus.
Yeah. And you mentioned kind of sad girl sort of rock music there. So Ida is, as we've heard, she's a musician. And I think personally, one of the hardest things for a fiction writer to do is to write music onto the page, because every reader is going to come to that with something different. Some people will be very into music, some people will not. But even regardless of whoever it is, it's very difficult to describe the sound of music on a page. Like it's very easy. I'm sure if you wrote a description of, I don't know, Let It Be by the Beatles or something, people could hear it in their heads. But when it's a song we don't know at all, that can be incredibly difficult. So what was your approach to talking about Ida's sound, and how did you want to convey or talk about the type of music that she writes and performs?
I wanted to keep it quite deliberately vague, to be honest, because I sort of want people to fill in the blanks themselves, and I want them to read it and hear whoever it is they have that relationship to. And we've all had that at different points in our lives. I personally had it with Fiona Apple's The Idler Wheel, which came out when I was 21. And I remember listening to that album and being at a particular point in my life and going through something very, very specific and thinking, oh my God, Fiona's written this for me. And I felt it so keenly and so personally. And I think everybody's had those moments, you know, at whatever stage in their life. And I wanted the genre of music it was to be vague enough that people could fill in blanks with that. And what I wanted to focus on was how that music made them feel. And the way I feel about certain musicians that I have a really intimate relationship to in my head, is that I feel seen, and that I feel like my pain or my happiness or my confusion has been put into words, that I am the protagonist of my own life, and that I'm walking down the street with my headphones in and I'm listening to the soundtrack of the movie that is my life. And that's how I wanted people to feel about Ida. And by keeping it sort of deliberately vague, but just showing the sort of outpourings of affection and the sort of craziness of it, I hoped that you would be able to get that balance. And also the level of love, like I love hearing stories about people who, you know, are so excited they just like faint at Beyonce concerts when she comes on stage and things like that. I think it's so cool.
Yeah.
And we have stories like that throughout history, people going crazy about the Beatles or things like that. I mean, I work in a theatre where a couple of years ago there was like a suggestion that Rihanna might come to see a show, and I just remember thinking like, that can't be possible, because I can't possibly be in the same room as Rihanna. Like, it just doesn't feel real. And that dichotomy of someone being your best friend and really close to you, and the voice you listen to as you fall asleep, and the voice you listen to as you go for a run or make your dinner, this constant sort of intimate presence in your home, is also this like mythological being and this like god that you can't possibly be in the same room as.
Yeah. Sort of as you talk about that, I'd love you to also talk a little bit about the ways in which, especially for musicians, I think over and above probably any other type of artist or creative person, there is a real entanglement between art and artist, and so in one way we think the music that they write is all about us, like you were describing. It's the music we go to sleep to. It speaks to a very particular sort of moment or experience they're going through. And in other ways it is music that is very much about them. And I think you sort of touched on this earlier about wondering about what they had experienced or gone through to write this particular song. Talk a little bit about how art might lead us to form a view about the artist that writes about it, but that view is often incomplete, because at the end of the day we don't really know what they're going through or kind of what they've been through or what they're writing about.
Yeah, I've always been really fascinated with stories about sort of muses and what it means to be a muse, but also what it means to have a body of work that is dedicated to or about a person and that relationship. I think it's really, really difficult not to read things into what people write and what they create, but particularly with music. And I think you're right. I think because it's like poetry, it's very, very difficult. Very few people write sort of like completely fictional poetry. People do retellings and things like that, but no one will write a poetry collection about an affair they didn't have, for example. And I think music is sort of similar because it's so intimate. And I think you're right that it's more than any other art form. And I think that's partly because of the sort of confessional nature of songwriting. And even when it's not a confessional, the way a lot of songs sound in their lyrics, they sound like someone talking to someone else. There's always an audience that's being addressed, whether that's one person or whether that's a group of people. I think that plays into it, but I think it's also to do with how we consume it, because there's almost nothing that we consume in quite the same way, where it doesn't just happen. It can happen in your bedroom. It can happen when you're on the toilet. It can happen when you're at a party, at a gig. There's so many different ways in which you can consume music, but you can also consume the same song over and over again. And there's like a time thing with that, because I mean, I know people who've gone to see the same play multiple times, which is, a very rare form of dedication. And, I obviously, there are certain novels I've read multiple times. I've read Antarctic Secret History more times than I can count. And same with Hannah Yami's White is Bewitching. Like, I know those books really well. But I will never read White is Bewitching, even the number of times that people have listened to the new Adele song in the last week. And that's only been out for a week. So you can know a piece of music more intimately, much quicker than you can anything else, which gives you quite a lot of time to sort of like ruminate and obsess about it, I think.
And you mentioned music, so Ehsan is Ida's muse, and often I think this is something we generally think, but also often has been shown to us through art, is that being a muse is something quite flattering. It's quite a desirable thing to be. But tell us about exploring the sort of the darker side of this, that resentment or the pressure that might be involved from both sides, for both the muse and for the person who is being inspired as well.
Yeah, I think it's really, really tricky because there's almost like a childlike fairy tale expectation that it is a compliment, and that having your portrait painted by someone is a compliment, or having someone write a song about you or write poetry about you is a compliment. But the sort of the darker underbelly of that is that when you're creating sort of like art at a certain level, you're not just painting like a complimentary portrait. It's much rawer than that. And it's not just sort of, roses are red, violets are blue, I love you. It's more, this is a full picture of who I think you are as a person. And I've painted that. And I think that it's got something to do with also how in love people are fundamentally unknowable. And within a relationship, you can have two completely different views of how that relationship is playing out. Sort of like that that bad art friend piece that was in the news recently, and how, one of them thought they were really good friends and that they had this, camaraderie and this sort of cultural exchange and writerly exchange, and the other person didn't think they were friends at all. And to a degree, that's possible within romantic relationships for two people to have completely different views of what it's like. And I think more so in romantic relationships, because you always feel like there has to be a bad guy, particularly in a relationship that's broken up and come back together again. Like, who is at fault and who is continuing to be at fault? So I think it can be really complicated to see something that is, again, so small and intimate then writ large. And the other thing I sort of wanted to explore with Aida and Ehsan is, so she's a rock star and she's written all of these songs about him, but he's a poet, and he sort of put their relationship to word as well, but just in a completely different form. And except it's much less successful. Sorry. And how that particular resentment can be amplified by a change in fortunes. And actually, I was really interested in that with their relationship anyway, because their story in the novel is that they used to go out when they were in their 20s, and then in their 30s, they meet again. And in the time they've spent apart, Ehsan has stayed basically where he is. His life hasn't moved on that much. And Ida's become a really famous rock star, and she's playing stadiums across the world. So it's sort of almost, it's a novel about the creation of art and what it means to be a muse, but it's also a novel about fame and, what would you do if your ex-boyfriend was like Harry Styles? Like, how would you cope with that? That would be really weird. And there's like a little bit of all this sort of like the Notting Hill question of, can a famous person fall in love with someone who's normal because their lives are so different? So I did want that to be sort of like a lighter exploration of that as well.
I do think so Ida and Ehsan do have this very romantic relationship in one sense. Like you say, they meet when they're younger and they fall in love, and then they reconnect again when they're older. But there are those big imbalances. So there's that big imbalance in kind of fame, which is a weird really have that imbalance. But there's also a big imbalance in power, in economic circumstances as well. What did those dynamics enable you to do with the novel and the characters? Because they're, I think at first there's a feeling of we can overcome anything, and then it becomes clear that we can't overcome anything, especially if we don't talk to each other about it.
Yeah, I think I was really interested in writing that imbalance, particularly within a heterosexual relationship where, even now I think there is an expectation that you'll either be at the same level or the male partner will be the one who earns more and is more successful, and flipping that completely, but also making it so dramatic, such a dramatic shift. I thought it was quite interesting. I thought it was quite interesting to put a character like Ehsan, who is one of the most difficult characters I've ever written, but also one of the ones I felt really connected to, because he's sort of a fish out of water. He is like a young Pakistani man who lives in London and feels quite disconnected living in London, doesn't and has sort of chosen a path that was different to what his parents and his teachers and all those things expected him to do. He works in publishing, he works with books, within Pakistani families, there's still, particularly if you're a boy, there's this idea that you'll, become a doctor or a lawyer or whatever. And he sort of bucked tradition in a way by going into this completely different industry, and hasn't quite found what he's looking for there, which is sort of heartbreaking and sort of like quite a difficult position to be in when you feel like you've rejected something else to make your own way, and then that hasn't quite worked out. And he's at a point when we meet him in the novel where he's at a loose end and doesn't really know what to do with himself, and then Ida comes along and sweeps him up into her life, and he just goes along for the ride, and he's off to America with her. And I thought, aside from the imbalance in finances, there's also this imbalance between, the imbalance in finances becomes an imbalance in how important their lives are, like how important their needs become. And within a relationship, when it's two people, if you're two sorts of regular people, you sort of can have that balance of like, oh, someone's job is really hard this week, so I'll take on most of the administrative stuff and give them a rest. Or you can have conversations about when someone's going to take a sabbatical or things like that. Like there's no even playing field, because she is the job and she sort of becomes his job. Like he fits into this machinery of people who are around her, who are like bringing her coffee and doing her makeup and changing her clothes and getting everything sorted for her. He becomes one of those people. Just because he's not doing any sort of like physical or manual labor, he becomes part of her team. He's almost like a handler or something, or like the person who's there for her, like her emotional support boyfriend. And even though she's not paying him, because it's her life that they are taking a journey on, the economic imbalance, I think, will always feel really, really keen.
It is fascinating to think about their relationship in those terms, because there were moments during reading where I was like, they're so in love. And then there were other moments where I was like, oh, she's so in love, but is he so in love? And that kind of deliberate to try and make the reader question not just other things about their relationship, but question their feelings for each other as well.
Yeah, it's quite difficult because I think it is difficult to be, I think it would be very, very boring to write, but I think, and psychologically less interesting, I think it's difficult to be in a constant state of being in love. I really, really wanted to explore that sort of explosive, extreme romantic intensity, but also you're sharing a very cramped domestic space 24/7 and it's not romantic, and you know you're suddenly thrown into this experience almost as roommates where every little thing will sort of spark off a reaction in the other person. It's interesting because I think within those chapters where they're on tour, a lot has, it's also like nothing happens, but a lot has to happen in order to get to the end of that act. And it's quite difficult to write something with like a sense of inevitability while you're also trying to keep the energy of a romance up. And so hopefully that sort of comes across.
No, it definitely does. You mentioned just a few moments ago that Ehsan is a Pakistani man living in London, and Ida also lives in London. And while we do spend a lot of time elsewhere, London is really crucial to understanding both of them. And for both characters, London is really alluring and it's incredibly isolating as well. Do you think that reflects a lot of people's relationship with the city and with big cities in general, particularly if you are from somewhere else and you are an outsider essentially? And I think both characters are outsiders, even when they're seemingly kind of on the inside, as it were.
Yeah, I think London can be a really, really difficult city. And it's, yeah, I think it's sort of the magic of it and the magic of moving anywhere that you've seen sort of so many films and TV shows and things about. So you have this, and like had so many songs about, you have this almost magical idea of it. And everybody's magical idea of it is slightly different. You know, I have an American housemate who moved to London. And I think her idea of it was sort of based on like Richard Curtis films. And, or, you know, whether, you know, you read like The Clash or whatever, like you can have there's so many different versions of fictional London that you can fall in love with before you move here and realize that it's kind of none of those, but also a little bit of every single one. And you kind of have to, I think the secret to it is almost you have to take the really magical moments, because everybody will have that occasionally where you'll, you know, be sitting in a coffee shop or something and there'll be someone famous in the next table, or you'll leave a bad meeting and end up walking across, and you'll be in a really bad mood and you'll walk across Tower Bridge at sunset or something, and you sort of have to let those moments happen to you and let those moments where it does feel like the fantasy happen to you. It's like being in love, I guess. You have to sort of like have the fantasy and the reality kind of hand in hand.
Yeah. You said earlier that you almost wanted to create like a cocoon between Ida-san and the reader. And I think one of the ways in which you do that is the ways in which you portray their relationships with their families, which are interesting to say the least. So obviously we only see those relationships through Ida and Ehsan's eyes, and we're sort of held at arm's length from them in the way that I think both characters kind of hold themselves at arm's length from their families, and in particular their parents as well. Why did you want that distance for both your characters and for us as readers?
It was really interesting. So really interestingly, someone recently said that an Indian reader recently said that they were reading the book and they didn't realize until like 30 pages in or something that it was a book about two brown people, which I quite like. Like, I quite like that it's not, I didn't want it to be a book that was sort of wearing its like Pakistaniness, you know, too heavily on its sleeves, despite the fact that it's all in there. And I was sort of trying to answer that question by saying, well, you know, it's not as if, you know, any of us wake up in the morning and we're like, oh, I've got to, you know, make my Pakistani chai and call my Pakistani mom and we'll talk about like our Pakistani lives. And but at the same time, having their parents be such a big part of the book did feel to me really important and felt like it had to be like a marker of authenticity in some way. And their relationship with their parents are quite distant, but they're also very constant in that I don't think I know many people who aren't South Asian who think about their parents that much in relation to their relationships, or what their perceived feeling of their relationships will be, as much as they do, as much as Ida and Ehsan do. So I really wanted that to be in there. I wanted their parents to be these, and that to be sort of like their cultures, these sorts of like looming scepters over the relationship that are part of why it might not work out between them in the long run. I think the distance is interesting because obviously both characters are displaced from their homelands. Ida grew up in America and Ehsan grew up in Pakistan, and they both meet living in London. So I sort of wanted it to be, this is just coming back to what we were saying about London before, I wanted London to be the space where their lives properly begin without their parents. And they both have very close relationships with them and lives that up until moving to London were maybe quite dominated by the family and maybe quite dominated by their parents and their parents' ideas for what they should do and how they should dress and how they should live. So I wanted London, and by that extension, their relationship, to be this space where they're sort of, you know, like children running free for the first time and making their own choices and trying to live a new way, not just in the ways that are expected of them.
I won't sort of spoil anything, but it is interesting to see how then Ida especially turns to family, or sort of tries to grip on to family when it sort of does all go wrong. And I think right at the beginning you were saying that when you were thinking about this book, every book or film that you saw that was about grief kind of seemed like a commentary on the Orpheus and Eurydice myth. And obviously grief is a big part of this novel, grief for people who have been lost, but then also grief for things that could have been, relationships that could have been, or whatever. What were you trying to say about the nature of grief, or the way in which we grieve through this book? And obviously grief is something right now that we are particularly occupied with, having lived through a pandemic where we have lost people but also lost time and lost experiences as well.
Yeah, it was, and I wrote quite a lot of the book during the pandemic, and I think you can tell in the second half. So it's a lot of time that a character spends in a hotel room by themselves, kind of, which I definitely wrote while being alone in my room for days and days and days, and being preoccupied, as you say, by ideas of grief and thoughts of that. And I sort of wanted to, basically what happens in the second half, and I don't think this is too much of a spoiler, is that after a traumatic event, Ida tries to connect with a family that isn't her own, to heal from it. And I wanted to write about grief in a way where you get both sides of it. And by that I mean the familial loss, which is experienced by multiple people in the novel, which is the loss of a person and the loss of what their life could have been, and the loss of all of the time you've spent with them and how much they mean to you, and what it means to wake up every day sorry, having lost someone. And then the other loss I wanted to explore, I think, is maybe slightly more particular to a romantic relationship and to the loss of a partner, because there aren't that many other kinds of grief where you've begun to plan your life around a person, and not just in small ways of, oh, I'll look after this person or I'll include this person in my life, but this is a person I'm planning on building a new life with and a new family with. And sort of taking Ida out of the world of her rock stardom and her fans and her support bubble felt like the only real way to explore what was happening to her. I didn't feel like having her stay in London or having her stay in America was going to be enough. I felt like it had to be pushed. She had to be pushed further.
I think that pushing is fascinating for us as readers, and it is perhaps something we're not quite expecting. And I think anyone familiar with kind of Greek myths, and particularly Greek tragedies, will know that there is a sort of formula to them, and will know how they usually end. How conscious were you of not adhering, but of kind of respecting that formula, but then also making sure that you were surprising your characters, you were surprising your readers, but also that you were surprising yourself as a writer, because you don't want to write something that is boring and predictable either. And so were you kind of thinking about those conventions and ways in which you could overturn them, or kind of flip our expectations while you were writing?
Yeah, definitely in the second half a lot, because as I said before, it used to be a much more conventional novel, and in the more conventional novel it happens exactly the way it does in the myth. Orpheus goes to the underworld to get Eurydice back. He charms Hades, he succeeds, and then he loses her at the last moment. And I had written a draft of the novel where it worked exactly like that. And I didn't feel that sense of discovery in writing it. I enjoyed it. I sort of, I created this entire underworld that was, my sort of weird, fantastical interpretation of what the afterlife was going to be like. And it was really, really fun to write, but I didn't feel a sense of discovery doing it. And I realized that by being faithful to the myth in this way, I was not writing about what I find interesting in the story. I don't find thinking about or imagining, to whatever degree, what happens after we die interesting. That wasn't the part of the Orpheus and Eurydice myth that was pulling me. What I find interesting is the idea of a love that is so strong that it means that when you lose your partner, you completely break down and you have to reimagine a new way of living. And I find this is a bit more metaphorical, but in the Orpheus looking back, I find the idea of regret that colours grief so deeply. Not just the regret for the life you could have had with this person, but regret for every mistake you made or every perceived mistake you made in the life you already had together. Those are the things about the myth that I find interesting. And by letting myself follow those impulses, instead of trying to write a straight retelling, I feel like I came to something that was a bit more of a discovery for myself and hopefully for the readers.
It seems apt as you talk about your sort of writing process in a way that my final question should be around inspiration. This is a book about writing and about art and about the nature of inspiration. Has it changed how you view inspiration and muses, and has it changed you as a writer at all in the course of writing this book?
That's a really good question. Has it changed how I feel about muses? Maybe a little bit. I think I definitely discovered a lot while writing it. And there were definitely things I thought about. I thought I had ideas about muses and inspiration that were quite complex. And then as I started writing it, I was like, no, you did not have ideas that were very well thought out or complex about this. And I did think, as we were saying before, that it would be a flattering thing. And it wasn't until I sort of started writing Ehsan's perspective. And by the way, I hate it when writers talk about their characters as if they're real and as if they're talking to them. But I do feel like I wrote it and I felt like the Ehsan character was telling me all of the reasons it wasn't flattering and all of the reasons it was a complicated, difficult thing to do. But at the same time, how inevitable it is, because all art is, to whatever degree, created out of, I think of it as like a sort of like a smoothie. You stick everything in like one of those little NutriBullets, and it's partly stuff that's happened to you and partly stuff that you've read or watched or heard someone else talk about on the bus that happened to them, and it all just sort of comes out together. I think it has made me think slightly differently about inspiration from other sources. And yeah, that was definitely something I was thinking about a lot in this book, and it ended up being a smaller part of it than I thought it was going to be. But I was definitely thinking about sort of famous couples and famous who were both artists and how they would borrow from each other and how that can sort of build resentment. I was thinking of that quite a lot. But on the other hand, I think it taught me that inspiration can come from lots of different places. Because we were talking about the second half of this book a little while before, and about Ida's process of grief and how the Orpheus character going into the underworld isn't what you expect. And I sort of started writing that in the way that I've written it, and I was like, this is a very strange thing that I'm doing. And then realized I was heavily inspired by Cocteau's Orpheus, which is a really, really beautiful surrealist film. And in it, Orpheus falls in love with his own death. And it's sort of a beautiful metaphor, but it's also just like a really wacky, fun journey. I think that's what I wanted. I wanted it to feel like familiar because you know the story, but also like you're still being taken somewhere new. Yeah.
Well, I think you absolutely succeeded. It is a stunning novel and one that I will go back to time and time again. I'm afraid that is all we have time for. Thank you very much to everyone watching, and thank you so much to Sarvat for her time and for telling us more about the Giant Dark. Goodbye.
Thank you, Sarah.